Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and welcome everyone to our 7th lecture of the Project Management Professional course. And so we basically, we're now in the third of our course, 40%, around 40% of the course has gone by. So again, as you notice, the days go by very quickly. Last lecture, we started explaining planning. So we started after, of course, we concluded explaining the initiation of the project. We moved on to explaining the planning of the project. And we mentioned that the objective here is to create or to put together a project management plan that consists of several subsidiary plans and baselines that cover all the aspects of the project that I need to plan for. For that reason, we mentioned that the project management plan is an integration of those different subsidiary plans and baselines in one master document that will describe how to execute the project work, how to monitor and close the project work, and how to monitor and control the project work, and how to close the project. And this is the project management plan. And we mentioned, I think, that if you notice here, all the planning processes, those covering the scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, all of them at the end of the day integrate in this integration process that we call the develop project management plan. So basically, this is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to create these subsidiary plans and integrate them in one master project management plan. Now, again, this is the traditional way of doing things. This is the traditional approach, while Agile, as you know, has different approach. So, yeah, I think this is what we explained last lecture. And now we want to proceed into creating the subsidiary plans. And we suggested that since we concluded the initiation phase of the project by identifying and documenting stakeholders in a stakeholder register, so it makes sense to proceed and develop a stakeholder engagement plan. So we start with this subsidiary plan, not, for instance, the scope, although, of course, you can start with the scope, you can start planning for the scope, but it makes more sense actually to start planning for the stakeholder engagement, especially that this is a very important and very critical, again, success factor of the project. You need to engage properly with all project stakeholders. You need to make sure that they are positively engaged, that they are supporting the project and the change that the project is bringing. So it's better that we start immediately planning for the stakeholder engagement, right? So let's go back to our presentation, and I think this is where we left at the end of the last lecture. So stakeholder engagement planning, the objective here is to gain the stakeholder support and to overcome their resistance if it exists. So basically we will cover two main points in this chapter, which are the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix, which is a matrix that we can use to assess the level of engagement of stakeholders, and the stakeholder engagement plan that we need to prepare in order to make sure that stakeholders are properly engaged throughout the project. So again, I need to develop strategies to make sure that stakeholders are properly engaged. It's very important, you know, to have a healthy relationship and to have a healthy engagement levels from stakeholders. Now, sometimes at the beginning, especially at the beginning of the project, you might face that high level of resistance from stakeholders, because they're still, they still don't know what this project is about, and why this project is important, and why this change is important. So especially at the beginning of the project, you will be faced with some kind of high level of resistance, of change resistance in the project. And that's why you need actually to act quickly. You need to develop those strategies in order to make sure how to communicate with those stakeholders, how to create, for instance, an awareness session or awareness plan for them in order to get to know what are the benefits of the project and why we are doing this project and how this project would impact them and impact the business positively and so on. So for that reason, we need to start again as soon as possible. Now, this is one thing that happens usually at the beginning of the project. The other thing that happens usually at a later stage in the project, that some of the stakeholders start to lose their interest in the project. At the beginning, they might be very, especially the positive stakeholders, they at the beginning of the project, they are enthusiastic, they are supporting, they want actually to support the project and to make it successful and so on. But as we proceed with a lot of work and a day goes on after day, some of those stakeholders might start to lose interest in the project. So for that reason, again, we need to develop a strategy for those stakeholders that have started to lose their interest for one reason or another in the project. So you need to actually develop those strategies. We need to make sure that we are providing the right level of management to those stakeholders, whether they are supportive, whether they are resistant to change, whether they are neutral about the project and so on. And we need to make sure that we're keeping a proper and healthy relationship and communication channels with those stakeholders. And we're doing whatever we can do in order to keep them involved and keep them engaged in the project. Now, this is a very nice and simple tool that you can use to assess the engagement levels of the stakeholders. This tool is called the Stakeholder Engagement Assessment Matrix, and it classifies the stakeholders into 5 groups. So basically, a stakeholder that we have identified and documented in the stakeholder register can now be classified into one of 5 groups. Those are 5 groups. Unaware, so those are the stakeholders that are still not aware of the project existence or of the project impact on them, on the business, on any other thing that might affect them. So basically, they're still unaware. For instance, stakeholder 1 is currently unaware. So we use C for the current engagement level, okay? While we want stakeholder 1 to be in another engagement level, which is supportive. It should be supportive to the project change, to the project results. Okay, so D stands here for the desired engagement level. Okay, so again, we have 5 levels of engagement, and those are the unaware stakeholder, the resistant stakeholder, and of course, this is the most dangerous stakeholder, the neutral stakeholder. So this is the stakeholder that is not supporting and not resisting. They're going with the flow, right? And the supportive stakeholder, and those are the stakeholders who support the project and the change that the project is bringing about. And the best engagement level is the leading engagement level. And those are the stakeholders that are not only supportive to the project, but also asking other people and other stakeholders as well, and encouraging other stakeholders as well to be supportive. So those are the people who lead the change, who lead the support of the project, right? So basically, this is again a very simple matrix where you want to include the stakeholders, of course, the key stakeholders. We don't need actually to assess all the stakeholders, the engagement level of the stakeholders of the project, but you take the most important, the key stakeholders, and you include them in this matrix, and you try to identify their current engagement level. So for instance, stakeholder 1 is currently unaware, stakeholder 2 is currently neutral, stakeholder 3 is currently supportive. And again, after consulting your project team, after consulting probably the experts in your project, you want to identify the desired engagement level. So stakeholder 1, who is currently unaware, should be supportive, while stakeholder 2, who is currently neutral, should be also supportive, while stakeholder 3, for instance, who is currently supportive, we need more of them. We need them to be leading, not only supportive, but leading. I need this guy to also motivate others in order to support the project, right? So it's very simple tool that you can use to assess the engagement levels of the project stakeholders and to go to your next step. Now, what is the next step now? After you have identified the current and desired engagement level, you basically try to do what? Again, to develop strategies in order to make this guy, in order to bridge the gap, right? In order to transfer or convert those people from their current engagement level to the desired engagement level. So how would I, and what strategy can I use with stakeholder 1 in order for them to be supportive, right? And what can I do with stakeholder 2 in order to convert them from only neutral to the project to be also supportive, and how I can convert stakeholder 3 from being merely supportive to be leading the project and the project efforts, right? So here you start developing the strategies. Now we'll talk about the strategies that you can develop later on. Supportive SH, what is SH? Supporting convincing resistance ones. We will talk about the strategies. Okay, now after you have identified the, again, or you assess the current and desired engagement levels, now you develop again the strategies. Now, most of the strategies that we will develop actually will, okay, try not to, please, to use terms that we might not be aware of, okay? You need to develop a stakeholder engagement plan. If you, this is one example. For instance, if you use language that the project stakeholders don't understand, or terms that the project stakeholders don't understand in your communication, people tend to, you know, to be afraid of things that they don't know. So basically, you need to make the communication as clear as possible, right? So this is what I was actually trying to tell you. Most of those strategies depend on creating transparency, mutual understanding, and mutual benefits, understanding or communication plan. So the objective here is basically to collaborate with those stakeholders in order to build trust with them. And trust building depends on, again, on communicating honestly with them, communicating clearly with them, opening a dialogue with them, allowing them to participate in the discussions, allowing them to share in this dialogue their thoughts and their fears and their perception about the things that are going on in the project, right? So it's very important here to have this transparency and dialogue and open communication channels and the clear language, so that everyone feels that they are welcome to participate and welcome to share their thoughts and their perception about the project. Of course, this requires a high level of interpersonal skills that you need to show as a project manager or as a project leader. You need to have this excellent interpersonal skills, in order to build the trust, and in order to communicate clearly and concisely, and in order to optimize the understanding and again, the benefits. You need to share with them the benefits of the project and the positive impact that the project should bring to them, and so on. Okay, so basically, these are the general strategies that you can use in order to plan for their engagement. And you need also to take into consideration the diversity that we indicated earlier. You might be working with people coming from different cultures, with people coming from different backgrounds, and so on. So you need to practice sometimes different leadership styles that suit those different kind of people and different kind of cultures and different kind of stakeholders. You need to be aware of their aims, their objectives, and how they build their relationships. And you need to focus again on coaching them, mentoring them, motivating them, while also welcoming this diversity and trying to benefit from the different cultures and different experiences and different backgrounds that you have in the project. Okay, so this is again very important that we have this inclusion, that everyone feels that they are part of the team and that they are welcomed in the working environment, and they can participate and they can share their thoughts with us. So this is very important in order to have again the right engagement levels from the stakeholders. Okay, so these are again some guidelines to develop a stakeholder engagement plan. Of course, again, the stakeholder engagement plan should integrate eventually with other plans as well, with resources and resource management plan, with communication and communication management plan, and with the project life cycle as a whole. So again, we need to make sure of integrating this now subsidiary plan that we have just created with the coming plans that we'll create later on. And we need to make sure all of the time of the integration of all these plans. This plan again will depend on a document that we have developed while initiating the project, which is the stakeholder register, right? So those are the stakeholders that we are dealing with, and they are documented in the stakeholder register, along with their level of impact and level of interest, as you remember. And this also helped me classify who are the key stakeholders, who are the stakeholders that I need to focus on more. Because again, I might not be concerned with creating an engagement plan for all the stakeholders, because I might have hundreds of stakeholders in the project. So I cannot do an assessment for hundreds of people, right? I need only to select the key stakeholders, those who have probably high impact and high interest in the project. So those are the stakeholders that I need to focus on. Again, you need to review the EEFs and OPAs, internal and external factors, and benefit from the previous project files, and follow again the policies and procedures and templates that the PMO might provide you with. You need to use again the expert judgment. We mentioned in the last lecture that expert judgment is a very critical tool for you. You need all the time to consult with experts, whether they are internal experts in the team or whether they are external from other departments or even from other organizations. As long as you need this judgment, you can consult the experts. Okay. For instance, I can consult with a PR expert on what is the proper approach to communicate with the stakeholders, for instance, in governmental positions, and gain their support, right? They will give you proper and probably a detailed judgment about how to manage your PR with government organizations and entities and so on, right? Hold meetings with experts and project team to define the, again, the required engagement levels. Use analytical techniques to classify them. So how do I classify them? I need to consult with the team. I need to consult with other stakeholders. I might need to review them, to analyze their situation, how the project is impacting them positively, negatively, and so on. And by doing this, we can create and document the stakeholder engagement plan. Now, again, if you want to check a template of the stakeholder engagement plan, you can find it where? You can find it in the book of forms that we included in the training materials. Okay, does that make sense? And by this, you have just created your first subsidiary plan, which is the stakeholder engagement plan. Now, let's move on to another aspect that we need to plan for, and this is probably the most important aspect, as we mentioned in the last lecture, and this is the scope. Scope, again, is very important to plan for because all other aspects will depend somehow on the scope. The schedule will depend on the scope. The cost will depend on the scope, right? The quality metrics will depend again on the scope. The resources that you need will depend on the scope and so on. So basically, scope planning is probably the most important aspect that I need to plan for carefully, okay? But before we start with scope planning, let's take 10 minutes for the prayers and get back to, okay? So see you in 10 minutes, inshallah. Welcome back to this lecture, and we're about to start discussing scope planning. So again, this is the most important aspect of the project that we need to plan for, probably, especially, of course, in the traditional approaches. While in agile approaches, as you know, scope has a different perspective, and we basically use another approach in order to manage the scope. So those are the important things that we will discuss here. The scope management plan. I remind you that we always start with developing a plan. So if you want to develop a scope, for instance, you need a plan for that. Who and how will we develop the scope, and who and how we will track the scope, validate the scope, report the scope, and so on. So every time you start planning for something, you need to start with a plan, right? You develop a plan, scope management plan, schedule management plan, cost management plan, and so on. And this is what we want to do here. We start by developing a scope management plan, the who's and how's. How are we going to develop the scope, monitor the scope, track the scope, validate the scope, and so on, okay? Another plan that we might also need here is the requirements management plan, because basically the scope is derived from the requirements, the stakeholders' requirements. So based on the stakeholders' requirements, we develop the scope of work. We identify the work needed in order to satisfy their requirements, right? And their requirements might be lots of things. Their requirements might be functional requirements, non-functional requirements, business requirements, quality requirements, training requirements, support requirements, legal requirements, compliance requirements. There can be so many things, right? And those requirements also need to be planned for, documented, tracked, traced, and so on. And for that reason, we also need probably to develop a requirements management plan. So again, the who and how of requirements management, who will collect the requirements and how will we collect the requirements, and who's responsible for tracking those requirements, and where will we document those requirements, and so on, right? So again, we might need another plan here, which is the requirements management plan. And then we will discuss the elicitation techniques. So what are the techniques that we can use in order to collect the requirements from those stakeholders and help them elaborate on those requirements? Because actually it's very important to us to collect those requirements as detailed as possible. So the more detailed requirements that we can collect, the clearer the scope will become, and the more or the easier we can manage the project. When you have a very clear scope, it becomes easier to manage your project. Okay, so the elicitation techniques. And after collecting those requirements, we need, of course, to document them. So we will have the requirements register where we document those requirements, or we basically also call them requirements documentation. Those requirements need to be tracked throughout the project life cycle. In order to make sure that we haven't forgotten about any requirement, I need a document to trace and track those requirements. And for that reason, we will discuss a document that is called the requirements traceability matrix. And after collecting and documenting all of those requirements, we can now develop a scope statement. Now, the scope statement is a detailed description of the work that needs to be done in order to satisfy the requirements that we have collected. And then after documenting the scope statement and identifying the scope and the scope boundaries, we need to find a better approach to manage the scope. So we break the scope into smaller pieces that we call the WBS, the work breakdown structure. So the work breakdown structure is basically the scope, but broken down in a hierarchical manner. So it makes it more manageable and easier to manage, okay? Right from the deliverables until we reach the last level, which is the work packages, okay? And last but not least, we discuss the agile considerations. So how in agile approaches, how we manage the scope, okay? So let's start with that, the scope management plan. Again, the scope management plan is one of the subsidiary plans, as we mentioned, one of the subsidiary project or program management plan that describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and validated. Again, any management plan is about the who and how, right? As we agreed. And in order for us to be able to develop a scope, we need, as I mentioned, to gather the requirements. Now, project requirements by definition are the agreed upon conditions or capabilities of the product. So what are the functions, the features that the product must meet or is designed to satisfy? Okay, I need to collect all of that. Now, in the charter, if you can remember, we identified actually some high-level requirements, right? So basically, it's a mobile application that can help people ask for food delivery to their homes, to their doorsteps. Now, this is high-level requirement. But now, we are not in the high-level phase, right? The initiation phase is over, and now we are in the planning phase. So we need to, again, to collect requirements as clearly and as detailed as possible, okay? And this will provide, again, the foundation of building the scope and building the WBS, the work breakdown structure. Now, as I mentioned, requirements can be lots of things. In some projects, requirements can reach or can be up to hundreds of requirements. And of course, I need a plan for that. Who will collect all of these requirements, and how we will collect all of these requirements, and how we will track those requirements when they change, for instance. So I need also a configuration management plan, probably as a part of the requirements management plan. And how will we prioritize, for instance, those requirements? Because at the end of the day, if I find out that I don't have enough time and budget to satisfy all the requirements, then I need to satisfy the most important requirements, right? So I need some kind of prioritization process in order to identify the most important requirements, right? And based on what those requirements will be prioritized. So what are the metrics, for instance, that we will use in order to prioritize those requirements and features and functions of the product, for instance. And how we will track again those requirements, how will we relate those requirements with project objectives, and how we will track them while executing the work in order to make sure that we haven't forgotten any of them. So this represents, or this constitutes, a requirements management plan that we need to develop. Now again, do I need to develop this plan all the time in all projects? No, it depends on your project size and your project complexity, right? If you have a very simple project with very few requirements, very clear requirements, you don't have to put a requirements management plan together, because it's very obvious, very easy, right? But if you have a large project with hundreds of requirements, then of course, you need to have a plan for how to manage the requirements throughout the project life cycle. Otherwise, it will be chaos. If you don't document them, track them, trace them, prioritize them, update them, make sure that they are updated and they are current all the time, then you will have a complete chaos in your project, right? For that reason, we need to develop a requirements management plan. And when you do that, you're ready now to start basically developing the scope. And we start developing the scope again by collecting and identifying the requirements, right? Here are some guidelines for collecting and eliciting some project requirements or project requirements. Review the scope. So again, we will depend on the scope management plan that we have developed. We will depend to the requirements management on the requirements management plan that we have developed. We will review the stakeholder engagement plan also that we have developed, because again, I need to collect requirements from stakeholders that should be positively engaged. If the stakeholders are not positively engaged, if the stakeholders are resistant, for instance, or are neutral or unaware, then you will face a lot of difficulties when you want to collect those requirements, correct or no? So you need to have, again, that proper engagement level in order to have them help you identifying and collecting requirements, right? You need also to make sure that there is no contradiction with the project charter. It's all aligned. You might also want to have a look at the project's stakeholder register in order to make sure that you included all the stakeholders, all the important stakeholders that you need to identify their requirements. And you start using tools that we will explain later on with details, like interviews, focus groups, facilitated workshops, in order to collect those requirements, and you document them, and you start tracing and tracking them using a traceability matrix, as we will explain later on. So now let's discuss some, probably a lot of elicitation techniques that we can use in order, again, to help stakeholders identify their requirements. Sometimes stakeholders cannot express their requirements very clearly. They don't know how to. So we can also try to help them identify their requirements and clarify and elaborate their requirements by using some of these tools, as you will see. So one of the tools, the first tool that we will discuss here, is document analysis. Now, this is something that you can do without consulting any stakeholder. You basically go to the documents that you have, for instance, the business plans that have been developed in the pre-project work, or the service agreement that you have developed with the contractor, for instance, or with the client if you are a contractor. Any marketing materials that might indicate some of the requirements for the product to satisfy. So again, you can go to those materials and analyze them. If you have current process diagrams, for instance, if you have some software documentation, for instance. So basically, you can go to all the documents that you have at hand at this stage of the project, and you analyze those documents and try to come up with requirements that you need to satisfy in the product or in the project, right? And you start, of course, documenting those requirements. So this is the first tool. Another tool that you can use, which is a very simple tool and a very direct tool, of course, which is interviews. So basically, you interview the stakeholders and you simply ask them about the requirements. What are your requirements in the product? How do you want the product to look like? How do you want the product to function? How do you like the performance of the product? How do you like the product stability, for instance, and so on, right? So interviewing is a formal or informal approach to elicit information from stakeholders by talking to them directly. It helps them, again, identify their requirements, goals, expectations in the project, and what are the features and functions that they want to see in the project deliverables. Now, let me remind you again, whatever we are explaining here is related to the process that is mentioned here, right? So now, if you go back to the process chart, you will find a process that is called collect requirements. And this is what we're explaining here, right? We're now explaining the tools and techniques that you can use to collect requirements, okay? So interviews is another tool that you can use to collect requirements. Another tool, which is focus groups, which is basically bringing together pre-qualified stakeholders, the stakeholders that you want to identify the requirements along with subject matter experts. You bring them together in a meeting and you start discussing their requirements in the product or in the service or in the result that the project will produce. Now, what's the point of bringing the SMEs, the subject matter experts, to this meeting? Because the subject matter experts will help, of course, the stakeholders identify the requirements and will also consult them by telling the stakeholders, for instance, what's technically possible, what's technically not possible, what is the cost of, for instance, achieving that specific requirement, because some requirements might be expensive. So are you sure you want to include it in the product? Some requirements might need a special kind of equipment that we don't have. So we cannot include it for instance, in the requirements and so on. So this is the point of including subject matter experts in order to play a role of consultants to those stakeholders while we clarify and identify and help them and collect their requirements, okay? So this is a less structured and more information sharing between the stakeholders and the SMEs. And of course, you need a moderator. If you don't do it yourself, then you need to bring in a moderator, someone who's trained actually to lead this discussion, to facilitate this discussion, because this is, a very probably technical and business discussion with people that are coming from different backgrounds. So you need actually to facilitate the meeting in a professional way to make sure that you get the best results of the meeting, okay? And this is also considered a form of qualitative research. So this is basically a research that we are doing qualitative research in order to create or in order to identify again requirements that are relevant, that are realistic, that we can include in the project scope. Okay, so this is again another tool. Another tool to collect requirements that you can use, especially if you have a very large number of stakeholders. Let's, for instance, you want to design a new mobile phone. The new mobile phone will be used by millions and millions of people, right? So how do I identify the requirements of those millions and millions of people? One easy tool is to create a questionnaire or survey, whether paper-based or electronic survey. So we can create a survey and, for instance, publish it on our website and ask people in general, what do you want to be included in this new mobile phone? How do you like this folded, for instance, new mobile phone to be? What are the most important features for you to have in your mobile phone? What are the most important functions for you to have in your mobile phone, and so on, right? So this is a survey that millions of people can link to and can participate in order for us to facilitate this process of collecting requirements, right? Another tool to collect requirements is benchmarking. So if you're creating a product and there is a similar product that, for instance, a competitor has, then you don't need to invent the wheel or reinvent the wheel, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to start from scratch again because you have a similar product, right? So basically what you can do is to check the similar product, probably the competitor product, and benchmark to it. So what are the things, what are the good things that the competitor product has, and what are basically probably the bad things that the competitor product has, and what to include in our product that will make our product stands out and be competitive in the market, right? So you don't need to do it all again from scratch, no, because you can benchmark your product to other competitors' products, right? And this will help you collect the requirements quickly. Now, while doing and collecting and documenting requirements, you need to take decision, or we need as a team to make decisions. What requirements to include, what requirements to exclude. Now, how we make decisions should also be agreed upon. Do we take decisions or make decisions in the project using unanimity, where everyone should agree, so I can accept this requirement? And if any one of the stakeholders objects to the requirement, then it will not be included. This is a unanimity approach to making decisions. Everyone should accept this requirement in order to include it in the scope. Or do we go by majority, where only 50% of the stakeholders should approve in order to include the requirement? Or should we go by plurality, where the largest number of stakeholders, they might not be the majority, they might not be 50%, but they might be 40%, for instance, but they are the largest group of stakeholders that decided that this is a requirement that we need to include, then we take the decision to include this requirement because we agreed that we will make decisions by plurality. Or is it an autocratic approach where only one person will take the final decision? It might be the customer, right? So the customer, we might discuss the requirements and, propose lots of requirements to the customer, but it's their final call, their final decision to select which requirement to include. So this is an autocratic approach. And actually, it might sometimes be a good approach because it's very quick and it's very efficient. You don't need to, discuss lots of people and, democracy sometimes have some, disadvantages, okay? So by following this approach, you have only one person that will make the final call. So you just need to explain to them the requirements, and they will decide finally which requirements to include and which requirements to exclude, okay? Another tool that you can also use while collecting requirements is what we call data representation. Now, data representation, again, using high visibility tools such as mind maps, affinity diagrams, will help you collect and relate the requirements. Now, I think most of you use those techniques or are aware of how to create a mind map, for instance, or an affinity diagram. Basically, affinity diagram, as you see here, is grouping similar requirements together. So when collecting different requirements from different stakeholders, sorry, you start to notice that some requirements are related. For instance, quality requirements. Then you basically collect them in one group and you call it the quality requirements. And then you have the performance, for instance, requirements. And then you have, for instance, the functional requirements, because they are all requirements that relate to the functions of the product. Design requirements, business requirements, and so on. So this basically helps you organize your way of gathering and collecting requirements, and help you also brainstorm with the team on what other quality requirements we have here, or we can include here, or what other functional requirements that we can include here, or what other performance requirements that we can include in this group, and so on. Okay, so this approach or representation, or again, using high visibility tools, can help you again visualize, the product, visualize the scope, visualize the requirements, and help you clarify them more. Okay, so data representation. Another tool and technique that you can use is observation. Now, if the customer, for instance, wants to build an accounting system, a new accounting system for them, then what you can do in order to collect the requirements in the new accounting system is send one of your team to the customer's office and ask them just to sit with their accountant and observe how they document their transactions, what kind of forms that they use, what kind of templates that they use, what is the template of the ledger that they use, and so on. So by observing the accountant at the customer's office and how they do the accounting, your team member can start collecting and documenting those requirements. So the system should do that, the system should be able to do that, the system should have the following forms, the system should include the following operations, and so on. Okay, this is what actually we want to indicate all the time. Do I need to use all of these techniques and tools in any project? The answer is simply no. Again, there is a very essential principle that we mentioned, which is tailoring, right? You need to tailor your management approach to the size and complexity of your project, as well as to your organization, as well as to the industry, right? We mentioned the tailoring and the importance of tailoring. So basically what you do here again is tailor the process. So what are the tools that are perfect fit for me in this project to collect requirements? Of course, I don't need to use all of these tools and techniques. I might be better off with only 2 techniques. I will do some interviews and then I will do a survey and that's it. Or I will do a benchmarking and I will do some interviews and that's it. Okay. So again, you and the team should tailor the processes select the proper tools, select the proper techniques, select the proper documents. You don't need to develop all the documents, right? I mentioned that so many times. You don't need to include all the project documents that we mentioned and that we explain here, right? And so on. So this is tailoring, of course, you need to do the tailoring, right? So observations, another tool to collect requirement is facilitated workshops. Again, if you have like large number of stakeholders, 40, 50 persons, and interviewing each one individually will take a lot of time, then what you can do is to invite them to a workshop where we will discuss all of their requirements and we will classify, categorize those requirements, and at the end of the day of the workshop, we create the final, or we shortlist the final requirements that they want to include. Now, this is what we call a workshop, and it again should be facilitated by a trained facilitator. This is important and sometimes can be difficult even for you as a project manager. If you don't have the relevant experience of facilitation, then you better recruit a facilitator to facilitate this workshop, because there will be a lot of different perspectives from people coming from different, areas of the organization, functional managers, directors from different branches in different countries, for instance. That happens, and we experienced that. So when you bring all of those people with different, experiences, backgrounds, and so on, then you need that professional facilitator in order to create the best results of this workshop. Okay. Another technique that you can use is by using prototypes. So basically, you start by collecting the key requirements of the product, and you create a prototype that you can show to your customer. Now, you show your customer this, for instance, this robot, and you ask them, what do you think about this robot? Have we satisfied your requirements in this first prototype? Then the customer will give you an immediate feedback, right? Will tell you, okay, I like that, I don't like that. We need here to add other things. So we have new requirements, new functional again, or quality requirements, or whatever requirements. So basically we go through an incremental cycle. Now this is an incremental approach, right? And by developing or creating prototypes, we collect those requirements incrementally every time, okay? So using prototypes also can be a good technique to collecting and elaborating requirements. Another tool and technique to collect requirements is storyboarding, where basically you use a whiteboard, especially in Agile, because Agile always prefers low-tech, high-touch tools, right? As we mentioned. So basically, you gather with your team, with the stakeholders, and you try to storyboard. So what is the story of using this product? How the people will use this product? What are the functions that the people can use in this product? And by doing this, storyboarding, you get to know, you get to identify the requirements that are needed to be included in the product. Okay, storyboarding. Another tool, which is the context diagrams. Now, this is a tool that system analysts, that software system analysts basically use, where we create, or the system analysts create, a context diagram expressing the different probably modules of the system and what are the functions that the different modules of the system do. So funding, request of funding, educational service, request for educational service, and so on. So by doing this analysis, this kind of analysis, by understanding how the different modules in the system interact and what are the different functions that different modules can perform, then you understand the requirements and you collect the requirements. Okay, so again, this is another tool. So all of these, I think they were like 10 or 12 elicitation techniques can be used, but do you need to use all of them in your project? Of course not. Of course not. You might use only 2 or 3 techniques and that's it. Okay, we need only to select the proper techniques that will help you properly identify and collect the requirements in the project. And the simpler, the better, always. The simpler techniques that you can use is the better, okay? Okay, now that we have identified and collected the requirements, we need to document them, of course, okay? So we basically document them in what we call a document that we call requirements register, or we call it also requirements documentation. And again, we can classify those requirements based on the category. So business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements, project requirements, transition requirements, when we want to implement the product at the customer side. We might also include assumptions like requirements, assumptions, dependencies, constraints on the requirements, and so on. Some requirements might have constraints. So for instance, this product should be working 99.99% of the time. So this is a constraint that I need to satisfy. Okay. So we create and we collect and we document all of these requirements, and we basically need to approve them, of course, by the proper stakeholders. Again, you need to notice that it's not only the functional requirements that you need to collect. We have also other important non-functional requirements that you need to include in your requirements collection. For instance, the availability. So this service that we will create should be available 99% of the time. And if some, I don't know, some catastrophe takes place, then how we will handle that in order to make sure of the availability of this service. A fire, in case of fire, for instance, right? The capacity, so the speed, the performance, the response of the product or the service, the continuity. Again, how to make sure of keeping this product working even in case of a disaster. Security, how this product will protect the privacy of the customer, for instance, the data, the information, the private information of the customer. So these are also other requirements. They are not functional. We don't discuss here the functions of the product or the service. We discuss here non-functional requirements, but are of equal importance as well. So we need to include them. We need to collect them, and we need to include them. Now, after you have done that and collected all of those requirements, and again, there might be hundreds of them, then you need to make sure that you will not forget and you will not allow some requirements to slip into the cracks. So what do you do for that? You can use this tool, which we call the requirements traceability matrix. So this is a matrix that we use in order to trace and track requirements. Now, there's a difference between tracing and tracking. And here's the difference. In order to understand what's the difference between tracing and tracking. Now, if you have identified a requirement, for instance, the customer tells you that they need this product to be very fast. I need this car to accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in 3 seconds. Okay, this is a requirement. So what you do is to trace and track this requirement. Tracing is linking this requirement to one of the project or business objectives. So why do you want this acceleration? Why do you want this acceleration? Why do you want the car to accelerate from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds? This requirement should be linked with one of the project objectives or business objectives that the charter indicated. So for instance, one of the project objectives was to create a sports car. So if you have this objective, then you can relate, you can trace this requirement back to the project objective. So we can accept it because it's related. But if it's not related, if we cannot trace it back to one of the project or business objectives, then we might probably not include it because it's irrelevant. Okay. Now this is tracing, while tracking is after we included and approved the requirement of acceleration, for instance, then I need to track this requirement to make sure that we will implement it, to make sure that we will include it in the scope, in the WBS, and we will implement it and we will test it and we will validate it, right? Because it's a requirement. So we need to track it, right? So this is the difference between tracing and tracking. And this tool, this traceability matrix will help you with that. Because here you can document the requirement. So what's the requirement description? And link it or trace it again to one of the business needs or objectives or project objectives, and then track it to the scope. Where does it exist in the scope? In which component of the WBS that we will discuss later on? And how can we make sure it will be included in the product design, for instance, or product development, and when and how we will test it. Okay. This is, of course, a template that you can modify according to your need, again, according to the product that you are creating. But again, the objective here is to trace the requirement to the source and to track it to the destination. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions so far? How are things so far? You find them simple or complicated? Yep, of course, a lot of information. Yeah, and you need, as a professional project manager, you need to know, again, lots of things. But will you use all of them? No, again, but you need to be aware of them, right? So, for instance, when we discussed the elicitation techniques, we discussed, I think, 10 or 12 elicitation techniques. Will you be using all of them? No, but you need to be aware of them, because every time in every project, you need to select the proper elicitation techniques that fit this specific project in this specific organization in this specific industry. Okay, and that's what makes you professional, basically, because the other not professional project managers will not be aware of the options that they have or the different ways that they can use to manage their projects, or the different approaches that they can use to manage their projects, and so on, right? And for that reason, actually, we need to understand all of these information. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. So after you have collected and documented all of those requirements, now you can, and based on these requirements that you have included, now you can start creating the scope, the project scope statement. So what is the work that we need to do in order to satisfy those requirements, right? So for instance, the requirement of acceleration from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds will require that we build an engine with certain horsepowers, right, to achieve this requirement, and also a transmission system, a gearbox that will be able to satisfy this requirement and so on. And those will also have certain requirements and so on, right? So now we can start creating our scope and include it in a document that we call a scope statement, which describes the project scope, major deliverables, assumptions, and constraints. Now, it's very important here to focus on assumptions and constraints. We might have included in the project charter some high-level assumptions and constraints, if you can remember, right? In the project charter, we probably documented some high-level assumptions and constraints. But here in the scope statement, and after elaborating and collecting all of the requirements of the stakeholders, now I need to document detailed assumptions and detailed constraints about the project and about the work that we need to do in order to satisfy those requirements. Okay. What are the tools and techniques that you can use to define the scope and to document the scope? Again, the expert judgment. So you need to consult with experts. What is the work that we need to do? What is the work that we need to include in the scope in order to satisfy those requirements that we have collected? And alternatives analysis. Now, this is very important because sometimes you can satisfy this requirement, but in a very lengthy and costly approach. While if you consulted the proper experts, they can suggest to you a very simple approach that will cost you a lot of dollars and that will save you a lot of dollars and save you a lot of time, right? So for that reason, we need to consider alternatives. Alternatives in equipment, alternatives in material that we can use in the project, alternatives in approach of doing things, right? So alternatives analysis is very important in order to make sure that we will do things that the work that we will include in the scope will be, we will try our best to have it as simple, as efficient, as cost effective as possible. Okay, so for that reason, we need to consider alternatives. And when we take decisions again of what is the work to include in the scope, sometimes we need to look at, or we need to use this tool, multi-criteria decision. So when you take a decision, you look at different criteria. So if we will do this work in this way, then I need to look at different criteria. For instance, how much will this cost us? How long will it take? Will it affect the quality of the product? How many resources it will need, and so on. So you're looking at different criteria, right? And based on the different criteria and the importance of those criteria to you, you take the right decision. You decide whether to go this way in developing the scope or the other way, right? So you need to consider multi-criteria. This requires, again, meeting with those experts and stakeholders and discussing those different approaches and alternatives. So again, you need to do facilitation for those meetings. And you need also to make sure that you will not forget any part of the product that you are developing or any part of the work that needs to be done. Then you can do a product analysis. Now, this is how you do basically, or how you can do product analysis. So product analysis is done to make sure that we fully understand the product and its characteristics, and that we will not forget any part of the product and their characteristics and their attributes. So in order to do a product analysis, what we can do, we can use different tools for product analysis. We can, for instance, do a product breakdown, where we take the product, for instance, the mobile phone, and you imagine that you are breaking it down to its smallest pieces, right? So by doing this, you understand every part of the product and the work that you need to do to develop that part of the product. So it's like breaking down the product to its smallest pieces, right? Otherwise, if it's not a product, if it's, for instance, a system, then you can do a system analysis using, for instance, use cases or context diagrams, such as the one that we have seen before. So system analysis, again, will help me identify all the functions that the system should be performing in order to satisfy, again, the requirements. So again, you need to look at the requirements and analyze the requirements, make sure that all the requirements will be satisfied. And again, you need to look at alternatives, because you need to find the best alternative, the best and the most cost-effective alternative of doing the job, of creating the product. And this is what we call, or what we label as, value analysis and value engineering. So value analysis and value engineering is selecting the best material and selecting the best approach that will yield the best value for the least cost. So I'm looking here at the value over cost. I need to deliver the best or the highest value at the least cost. So again, what are the most cost-effective materials that we can use? What is the best approach of delivering the work to yield the best value at the least cost? Okay. Of course, now we have courses actually in value analysis and value engineering. Value analysis and value engineering has become a very important science, especially in the construction projects, because you can save actually the customer, and you can save the company millions of dollars if you do proper value analysis and value engineering. Okay, so doing those or using those tools and techniques will help you develop the project scope statement. And these are some guidelines while you are developing the scope statement. You need, of course, to review the scope management plan that has indicated who and how the scope statement should be developed, traced, tracked, and so on. You need to make sure that no contradiction will exist with the project charter. You need to review the requirements and make sure that they are all satisfied. You can also review the OPAs to benefit from the previous project documents and lessons learned and so on. And you use the tools and techniques that we mentioned to document the project scope statement. And of course, again, I need to remind you that all project documents are subject to continuous update, right? So if you develop now the project scope statement at this stage, it's not the final scope statement, right? We anticipate, we expect this document to be updated several times while we continue planning for other aspects of the project, right? Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Okay, let's take now 15 minutes break before discussing the very and probably the most important process in traditional projects, which is creating the WBS, creating the work breakdown structure of the project. So 15 minutes and we'll get back to you. Thank you. So welcome back to the lecture. Again, we are discussing planning for the scope of the project. We started by developing a scope management plan. So who and how we will manage the scope throughout the project. And then again, probably a requirements management plan of the who and how of requirement management throughout the project. And then we started by collecting all requirements from all stakeholders about the project and documented those requirements on a requirements traceability matrix. And then we developed a scope statement that describes in details the project deliverables and the constraints and assumptions of the project. And basically also the boundaries is very important here to indicate the boundaries of the scope. So what is the work to be included in the project and what is the work to be excluded out of the project. And by developing the scope statement, you have now a very good understanding of the work that needs to be done, but not in an organized way. It's only a descriptive matter, you know, of you have just described the work that needs to be done thoroughly, but it's not organized. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's just a descriptive way of documenting the scope. So we need to take that further to a better step. And we do this actually by creating what we call the WBS, which stands for Work Breakdown Structure. So what is the WBS? It's a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. So instead of, and I use this, you know, metaphor all the time. So basically the scope that you have now is, again, is a description of the work that needs to be done. But where to start from? What is the pieces that we can start with, and how we can, you know, tackle this work is not pretty much understandable to us yet. It's just like having, you know, a pizza that you need to eat. So you're not really sure of how to eat this pizza, right? Because it's not, you know, it's just a huge thing that is proposed to you. But if you now take this pizza pie and you start slicing it and decompose, right, this pizza into smaller and smaller parts, then now you can eat it, right? Now it's pretty much easy to start eating the pizza after you have, you know, decompose it into more manageable and smaller components. And this is the purpose actually of creating a WBS. So the scope is probably to create a new car, but I need to understand well how to create this car, right? So this car, for instance, consists of mechanical system, electrical system, body, and then the electrical system consists of different parts, and then the mechanical system consists of different parts. So you decompose the deliverable into sub-deliverables and then sub-deliverables, and you continue decomposing until you reach the last level of decomposition that is sufficient and necessary. It's sufficient because it describes the work well that needs to be done in order to create, for instance, the engine of the car, or in order to install the transmission in the car. So it's sufficient. You don't need to decompose further. And necessary, which means that you cannot do the scope without it. If you don't do this work, if you don't do this work package, then the scope will be missing something, right? So these are the components here are what we call the work packages. So the components at the lowest level of decomposition are called the work packages, because they actually describe some work that we need to do in order to build a part of the scope, in order to build part of the engine, part of the multimedia system, part of the ABS braking system, and so on. And those basically later on, when we start creating the schedule, those work packages will be translated and further composed into activities or tasks that we will assign to the team. Activities or tasks that we will assign to the team, okay? But not at this stage. When we start creating the schedule, not at this stage. At this stage, we only stop at this level, the work packages, which describe the work that needs to be done in order to create this part, right? So basically, it's a matter of decomposition, and this is a very powerful tool, you know, that you can use even in your personal life. If you have a very complicated problem that you need to think of, then what you can do, or the best thing you can do, is actually to decompose this problem into smaller problems that you can tackle one after another. Okay, no, nothing here to be indicated until to this point. We don't include any dates, we're just decomposing. We're just decomposing the scope into more manageable pieces, okay? Now, after doing the WBS, there will be another document that we will use to describe the WBS, which is the WBS dictionary. When we reach it, we'll talk about it, okay? But at this point now, we are only decomposing the scope into more manageable and smaller components, okay? To show you an example, of course, you can do this with a paper and pen. You can do this with lots of softwares. But let me show you an example with a tool that I personally use, software that I personally use and I prefer using for creating the WBS, which is the WBS Chart Pro. Good question. Who does this? Who creates the WBS? Is it the project manager? Who can answer this? Who creates the WBS? Remember, it's all the time, it's a collaborative work, okay? So the project manager facilitates the process or leads the process with the team, with other stakeholders as well if needed, to create any part of whatever we are creating, whether it's a scope, whether it's a schedule, whether it's a quality management plan, anything that we are discussing. When I say we will create or you will create something, it doesn't mean the project manager alone. Basically, again, the project manager is only leading, coaching, facilitating, guiding. The team, they are primarily responsible for doing all of that, as well as other stakeholders, okay? Never forget this rule. You don't do this alone, okay? And you're probably not even qualified to do it alone. Okay. So here's one software, and very actually simple software that you can use to create a WBS. It's called the WBS Chart Pro. So basically you can start from here to create the first level. I'll just zoom in a little bit. The first level is the final deliverable, right? So for instance, let's assume that my project is about creating a website, a company's website, okay? And then you start decomposing, right? So the website, for instance, will have different sections. It will have the home page, the services page, for instance, customer support page, contact us page, and so on, right? Now the home page let's decompose it. How can I develop a home page? Right? So you might think I need first to do the design of the home page, right? And then do the development of the home page. Probably before doing the development, I forgot I need to include something, which is preparing content, right? Content of the home page. And then probably I need to do some testing when I'm finished with that. Okay. Now, again, the same goes for other parts as well. So after home page, maybe services. So I need to do something about the services. Maybe I need to, again, to design, develop, test, and so on, right? The customer support might be a little bit complicated because there is an interaction with the customers. So you need, for instance, to develop a database and develop a chatting system and so on, right? So basically, and as you see, this will help you take this, again, this scope that was only described in words and make it more visible and more manageable. And you might also find that this part actually does not fit here, it fits in here. So you just take it here and add it here. Or you might find that you need to take it in here, for instance, under testing, right? And so on, okay? So again, the lowest level of decomposition, the components here in the lowest level of decomposition is what we call what? What is the name of these? We call them work packages, because again, they describe the work that needs to be done. So the home page needs to be designed, the content should be prepared, the home page needs to be developed, and so on. Okay. Okay. Now, one important thing here is you have here a component that is called design, and you have here another component that is called design, right? So we have two components with the same name. Now that might be confusing a little bit, right? Because if the project manager now wants to know what is the progress of the design component, we will be confused. What design do you mean? Because we have two components with the same name, right? So how to avoid this problem? We need to use a numbering system or a coding system for each component to have its unique number. So we don't have this confusion, right? Now there's a standard way of numbering, and this software uses this standard way of numbering, where you basically start from the highest level and you give it the number 1. See here, this is the number 1. And then this part or this component will be the sum of this component. So basically it's 1.1. While this here is, what do you think this would be? This is 1.2, right? And so on. So for instance, this would be what? As a standard numbering system, what do you think this would be? 1, 2, 2. Exactly. If you double click on it, 1, 2, 2, and so on. So by doing this, actually, you're making sure that each component has its own unique identifier or system. This is number 1. And number 2, you know exactly at which level you are standing. So when you see 1.2.2, you know that this component exists at the 3rd level of decomposition. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, it's called WBS Chart Pro. It's, by the way, it's a very old software. I doubt you can find it now. You might find an updated version of it. Okay, but I still use it because it it does the job. It does the job very simply and very perfectly. Okay. So here you go. This is the WBS. Okay. Okay. So it's a matter of decomposition, but again, instead of, for instance, using this kind of decomposition in a Word text, which might be using, the numbering system in Microsoft Word, you might get these results, but it doesn't really give you that kind of high visibility that we are seeking. While when we create it using a hierarchical structure, it was pretty much visible and understandable. When you do the WBS, or let me actually go back here. Now we agreed that the components at the lowest level of decomposition are what we call the work packages. Right? Now the components at the second level, usually, we call them control accounts. So homepage is a control account, services is a control account, customer support is a control account. Now, what's the idea of assigning control account? The idea of assigning control account is the ability to measure the performance of this part of the project. So if I want to know how much did we spend, for instance, until today to develop the home page specifically, I need to look at the control account of the home page, right? So if you have assigned a number and assigned home page as a control account, now you can track any expenses here. You can track the time spent here. You can report the performance in this control account. The same for services, the same for customer support, and so on. So basically, any important part of your project that you want to control, you want to monitor, you want to measure the performance, you assign a control account to it. And this is what we do usually at the second level, because we want to control each important chunk of the project. Okay, so this is the reason of assigning control accounts and tracking them later on. So control account can be used to track scope, budget, actual cost, schedule. Okay, and you notice that each control account will have several work packages, right? Because the control account itself is decomposed further into packages. So basically, it will include, yes, different work packages. And whenever you spend something on some work in the work package, it will be accumulated in the work account, right? So this is the way of how control accounts work. Now, another components in the WBS might be a little bit ambiguous at this point. So we're not sure at this, for instance, component or at this level, especially if you have like now further levels of decomposition. Now, at this level, for instance, or at this level, I might not be sure of what we will be doing at this level. So I will just leave it as is for now until we reach that point. So if we go back here, so this is a component that me and my team, again, we're not sure of what work to include in this component, or whether we're going to contract someone, for instance, to do it. So I'll just leave it as a planning package that we will elaborate more on it when we reach it. Okay, so you can do that as well. You can assign some components to be planning packages. Okay, we don't have detailed schedule for that. We don't know exactly what to do with that. So we'll leave it until we reach it. Okay. This is, of course, the code of accounts that I have just explained, and you have a standard way of coding or numbering the components. And here are the guidelines of creating a WBS. So again, basically, you do that while reviewing the scope management plan and the project scope statement that has defined the project scope with the requirements as well. You take into consideration, of course, the enterprise environmental factors and the OPAs. This is very important. Now you can go back to similar projects and check their WBSs and benchmark to them, right? You can use tools and techniques such as decomposition. And of course, you need to use the expert judgment as well, because the experts will tell you how to decompose further and further. And you include notes on work products that might be delivered incrementally. So if I can create something now and again increment on it, then this is a preferred choice. As I mentioned before, the customer would always like to have the product built incrementally, because they can see that the investment is or has a quick return. And document the scope baseline. Now, by creating the WBS actually, and by having now we have two very important documents, which are the scope statement and the WBS. Now the WBS, there is another document that will be attached to the WBS, which we call the WBS dictionary. We will explain it in a bit. Now those three documents together will constitute the baseline, our first baseline in the project that we have just developed. So the scope baseline here consists of three documents: the scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary. Or you can, if you want, two documents, which are the scope statement and WBS, because the WBS dictionary is actually attached to the WBS. Okay. So basically, when again we say baseline, then we mean this is the version that is approved. Of course, not now, but when we finish developing all the plans, we take them to the management, or we take them to the customer, and we get them approved, right? So once approved, those documents will represent the baseline that cannot be changed without a formal change request, right? This is what we discussed earlier about baselines. So those are the approved versions that cannot be changed without a formal change request. And that will be used to measure performance. When we start doing the job, we will measure performance against those documents and this baseline. Okay, does that make sense? So far, any questions so far? Now, the WBS dictionary, after you have developed the WBS, we have a question. Is the planning package has no subcomponents? It might have some subcomponents, Muhammad. The planning package might have some, to my understanding, to the level of knowledge that I have, I might include some subcomponents, but again, it's not exactly clear to me whether these components are okay or not. I need to check that after a while, after when we reach that point. Okay. Okay, so after developing the WBS, I might find it a good idea to start attaching some information to the WBS. I need to make kind of description for each component in the WBS, especially the work packages, you know. So whatever information that I can elaborate at this stage, Again, there is a progressive elaboration, don't forget. So now I can elaborate something, I have some information. But later on, and as we proceed more and more in planning for the project, more information will flow in, and I can go all the time and update all the documents, right? But at this point, at this stage now, I start attaching some information and some explanation to the components in the WBS. For instance, of course, the code of account identifier or the ID of each component, description of the work. So what we will be doing in this component, what we'll be doing in this component, assumptions for this component and constraints for each component, if I can elaborate, or whatever I can elaborate at this point, right? Who is responsible for doing this component? Is it considered a milestone? Will it be represented as a milestone in the schedule when we reach the stage where we develop or we start developing the project schedule? What are the activities that can be included at this work package? What are the resources required? What are the cost estimates? What are the quality metrics for this component? What are the acceptance criteria for this component? Any technical references, any agreement information. So whatever information I can have for each component, I can start to include in this document that we call the WBS dictionary, okay? Now, of course, at this stage, now you have probably little information, but as we proceed, we can include more and update the WBS dictionary more and more, okay? Does that make sense? Any questions so far? So again, by developing this, we have now 3 important documents that we can identify as a scope baseline, which are the project scope statement, the WBS, including the work packages, planning packages, control accounts, and everything, and the WBS dictionary. Okay, any question? So this is how we approach the scope, and this is how we develop the scope in traditional approaches. Now, how about agile approaches? Of course, this is something different, right? So let's see how agile approaches manage scope and develop scope. So we start by explaining the inverted triangle in the agile approaches, the product and sprint backlogs that we have explained earlier, but just to remind you, features, user stories, all of these are components of the scope. The estimation techniques that the team used to estimate the size of the scope, prioritization techniques to prioritize the different parts of the scope, and consensus, reaching a consensus on the scope in Agile. Now, the first idea about scoping in Agile, that we use a model that we call the inverted triangle. Now, in traditional approaches, as you know, the scope should be clear, right? As we explained just a few minutes earlier, you try your best with the team to collect all the requirements from all the stakeholders, and based on these clear requirements, you develop a clear scope and you manage it, right? Okay, so we have a clear scope, a fixed scope that cannot be changed later on without a formal change request. And based on the scope that you have developed with your team, you will identify the cost and time. So cost and time are functions of scope. They change according to the scope. They are developed as a function or in relationship to scope, okay? Now, the agile approaches use an inverted triangle where actually the cost and time are fixed. So when we start working in the project, we agree with the management or we agree with the client, if we have a client, on a fixed cost and time. We will work for 6 months with a budget of $1 million, So this is a fixed cost and a fixed time to develop a mobile application, a vision. But now the scope, the details of the mobile application, what features, what functions, what user stories, can now what? Can be changed at any point, right? As we explained, it's variable now. So the fixed here is the cost and time, while in traditional approaches, the fixed was a scope, right? And the variables here is the scope, while in traditional approaches, they were the cost and time. Does that make sense? Okay. What's the document that we use to document the scope and to control and track the scope in Agile? We mentioned it earlier, right? It's the product backlog. And the product backlog is owned by whom? Who develops the product backlog and who updates the product backlog all the time? Yes, it was the product owner. So it's someone that is assigned by the management or the customer to represent, again, the business requirements. Product owner, and the product owner owns the product backlog and updates and prioritizes the items in the product backlog all the time, right? And this is what we call grooming or refining, product backlog refining or refinement, where the product owner all the time updates and reprioritizes the items in the product backlog according to the value, right? And so basically the items that we have in the product backlog are referred to by PBI, product backlog items. So the item can be, again, if you remember, we explained that earlier, it can be an epic when we start epic that, again, needs clarification. And then the epics can be broken down or elaborated into features. And then features can be elaborated into functions. And then functions can be elaborated into user stories. So I need to, or the product owner, actually, the product owner needs to groom or to refine the product backlog items until they are user stories, right? And whenever the team creates a user story and it gets accepted by the product owner at the sprint review at the final meeting, and the product owner accepts this user story, then this item will be dropped off. It will be taken out of the product backlog, okay? There's another backlog, if you remember, which is the iteration or the sprint backlog. Now, this is the backlog of the things, of the items that the team will create during only this coming sprint, okay? And the sprint backlog cannot be changed. We mentioned that, right? Once we start the sprint, it cannot be changed. The sprint can be canceled, but no changes are allowed during the sprint, no changes to the sprint backlog. And the sprint backlog is actually owned by the team, because the team will translate the sprint backlog into tasks that they, distribute to themselves, okay? So teams estimate the effort size of work and understand the priorities of the business. Of course, whenever we talk value or business requirements, is the product owner who decides on them, okay? So again, I'll just remind you, so we might start with epics, which are large stories. The customer can tell you, for instance, I need the application to be able to identify the closest restaurant to the customer, okay? Now, this is an epic, because this includes a lot of features that you need to work on. The GPS, the distance measuring, probably other things as well concerning the performance and security and APIs that will be included and so on. So having the capability of identifying the closest restaurants to a customer is an epic that needs to be actually broken down. It's a similar process of the WBS, right? But here we are breaking down epics into features. So I need a feature of reading the GPS, for instance, information. And then the feature might also be broken down further into functions. So the feature can become a group of related functionalities that deliver value and deliver capability of, identifying the geographical location precisely. So this feature and the functions that will follow represent the value again of the system. And when we measure the performance in the project in Agile, this is one important metric actually to be considered. How many features have been developed and accepted out of the total number of features? So if we have developed, for instance, 10 features and they have been tested and accepted, out of 20 features that we have agreed on with the customer, then the progress of the project is 50%. Okay, so this can be an important performance indicator as well, or a key performance indicator that we can use in Agile approaches. Now, functions are better understood when you represent them with a story, or when you articulate them with a story, because a story expresses value. When you ask the users about telling you about a story of how they want to use the system, or how they want to use the mobile application, or how they want to use whatever the product is, and they tell you a story, you understand, or you see the value of it, right? And there is a standard way in Agile that we usually use when we want to formulate, or when we ask actually the product owner. The product owner is, again, the one responsible for formulating the story. The product owner should formulate the story, the user story, because he or she represents the business requirements and the users. So this is the standard way of formulating the story. The story should follow this context. When, and then the situation. So for instance, when I log in to the system, I want to, for instance, I want to update my personal profile, so I want to represent the motivation, so I can have a personal profile that can be seen for any other users in order to interact with me, for instance. So what is the value or the outcome, the expected outcome? So the product owner should take the functions and formulate them in this specific context. When I want to, so that is again, or so I can, so that represents the value or the benefit. Why do you want to do this? The question, the most important question here is, why do you want to do this? When you tell me why you want to do this, I understand the value and the benefit of it. And of course, we prioritize according to the value, right? So these are the user stories. Now, when the product owner develops the user stories and gives the team the user stories that they need to work on, the team start estimating the size of those work stories. Now, remember again, the user stories will become the product backlog items, the PBIs, okay? Now, the team, in the first day of the sprint, we mentioned that there's a sprint planning meeting where the team meet the product owner and they discuss and they decide on which product backlog items or user stories they will work. And they will do this, to be able to do this, they need to estimate the size of those work of those user stories, right? Now, how does the team estimate the size of the user stories? Now, what we mean by size, the user story size, the size includes the complexity, the time it needs to be developed, probably also the cost that it needs to be developed. So the more size it has, the more time it will take, the more complex it is, the more costly it will be, and so on, okay? Now, Agile have certain approaches in estimating. In traditional approaches, we use the hours, right? We use the hours or days. In Agile approaches, it's very simple, right? You have a work to do, you estimate it by hours or you estimate it by days. But here, no. Here, the team has a user story that needs to be developed. They estimate the size by points. And those points are, they don't have unit of measure. They are not in dollars, they are not in hours, they are without a unit of measure, okay? They only express, again, the size, the complexity of the user story. But we also use certain numbers. We don't use any number. No, we use specifically the Fibonacci sequence numbers. Now, if you have ever heard of the Fibonacci sequence number, this is a very famous sequence, which goes as follows. Now, Fibonacci is the name of the scholar that has introduced the sequence. Now, it starts with 0, and then 1, and then any number that comes is basically the sum of the two previous numbers, okay? So now 0 and 1 equals 1, okay? Now the number that follows is the sum of the two previous numbers. So 1 and 1 is 2. Now what's the next number? 1 and 2 is 3. What's the next number? 2 and 3, yes, is 5. 3 and 5 is 8. 8 and 5 is 13. 13 and 8 is 21, and so on, okay? So when the team estimates the size of the user story, they are allowed only to use these numbers. Now, there's a reason, of course, for that. I'm going to send you a very interesting video about on the group about what's the reason for that. But actually, since it's a relative sizing, where, you know, for instance, the most complicated user story will take 21, and the simplest user story will take 1. So it makes sense now, if you have a story in between, to choose which number the size of it fits, like 8, or is it more close to 21, so I'll take 13, or is it more close to the simplicity, so it's 2 or 3, and so on. Okay, I'm going to send you, like, there's an interesting video about, or why we use Fibonacci sequence. And by the way, a Fibonacci sequence has lots of impressive, actually, uses. Try to Google it. It's a very interesting, actually, sequence. They call it also the golden sequence, and they call it also the sequence of beauty, because basically, if you look at, you know, different things in the nature, the very beautiful things in the nature, the design of the very beautiful things in the nature follow the same sequence of the Fibonacci sequence. Anyways, okay, so the team can use only these numbers. Now, another approach of estimating the size of user stories is what we call the T-shirt sizing, where we use T-shirt sizes, like, you know, XX small, small, large, and so on. Let's have a look at that, okay? So basically, you have, for instance, you know, the usual T-shirt sizes: X small, small, medium, large, X large, XS large. You can also add, if you want, XXS, for instance, or XXL, and so on. And you take your user stories and you match them with the size. So this is a very simple and easy user story. You you match it with the XS, with X small. And then you take the most complicated user story and you match it with the XXL size. And then you take the other stories and you try to match each story with its size. This is what we call relative, right? Relative sizing. And the estimation here in Agile follows this relative sizing, okay? This is another way of relative sizing, you know? If you are building a room, then it's 1. If you are building, I don't know, an opera, then it's 5. If you are building like, I don't know, Disneyland, then it's 13. If you're doing a tower, then it's 20. If you're doing Burj Khalifa, then it's 40, and so on, okay? So this is how estimation works. Now, in order for the team to come to a consensus, because this is very important, when we estimate the size of any user story, I need to make sure that the team, all the team, agree on the size. So for instance, if someone estimates the size with 1 and other one estimates the size of 13, then there's a huge difference, right? And I know there is a huge difference in perspective and perceptions. Why does this team member estimate the size with 1 while the other one estimates the size with 13? For this reason, we might use this tool that we call planning poker. So basically, we give all team members, we give them cards, and those cards have Fibonacci numbers only, not the regular cards, you know, that you find while planning poker. I don't think you planned poker, but okay, or you played poker before. So basically, you give your team members cards with Fibonacci numbers, okay? And then when the product owner explains the user's story, and at the same time, they are holding, of course, their cards to themselves. At the same time, each one of the team members will take the number, the size number that they think fits the user story, and they flash it, okay? So if all team members, for instance, flash the 5 at the same time, then we have a consensus, right? All team members think that this story is relatively small, is 5. But for instance, if someone flashes 5 and someone or other one flashes 21, then we know that there's something wrong and we need to discuss this. So why do you think this is a large story and why do you think this is a simple story? What's your point of view and what's your point of view? So we discuss and negotiate, and then we play a game. We do another round. Okay, we might do second round, third round, until we reach what? This consensus, because it's important at the end of the day that all team members agree on the size of the user story. Okay, this is how scope estimation is done in Agile. Does it make sense? Agile, you know, have its own like mindset and its own terms and its own games. Okay, so this is how we handle the scope and scope estimation in the in Agile approaches. Now again, story points, those points that we use the Fibonacci sequence, represent the size, and the size takes into consideration the risks while we are developing the story, or the level of effort, the effort that we need to put in developing those stories, or potential pitfalls. So the team, when the team decides on the story point, they need to take that into consideration. Okay. Again, it's a relative sizing, because, for instance, if you don't, no, I think I just mentioned it. If you don't use Fibonacci sequence, if you use the usual numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, how can you distinguish between 5 and 6? How can the team say this story is 5 and the story is 6? They are very close, right? But when you have these gaps, 1, 2, 3, okay, and then 5, and then 8, and then 13. You have better relative sizing that you can use. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Again, it's a unitless measure. We don't use any unit of measure for the points. They are only merely points, okay? Okay. I think we better stop here. Okay, we will talk in the next lecture, inshallah, about the prioritization techniques. Okay, so how can we help the product owner prioritize those user stories according to their value? Okay. Question, it seems hours-based estimate has less risk completed to all other methods. Other methods seems opinions and expenses is not correct. No, not at all. Not at all. Actually, when you use effort or time, hours, you don't take, maybe you don't take into consideration certain factors of complexity, of ambiguity in the tasks, or ambiguity in developing the work that needs to be done. Now, remember, Agile is basically designed to fit technical projects where we have a high level of ambiguity, where, for instance, a new technology can cut a lot of hours for you. So for this reason, we use actually a number that represents the size, the complexity of doing this. And this includes, again, the hours, the efforts, includes the risk, includes ambiguity, includes uncertainty, and so on. Okay? No, next, inshallah, next lecture, we have set of questions. Next lecture, we will have another round of questions. Okay. Any other question? Any other question? Great. Thank you, and see you Tuesday, inshallah, where we will be explaining how to prioritize the user stories according to the value. Thanks, and have a nice evening, and goodbye.